Hello, everyone. My name is Tong Zhou. I'm the lead statistician working in the Cancer Biomarker Center, CRUK Manchester Institute. It's my pleasure today to host today's event for the Royal Statistical Society, Manchester Local Group. Before we start, may I remind everyone to stay on mute and to turn your cameras off. And we will have time for questions at the end of the event. So please type any questions you have into the chat. And finally, we are recording this event and it will be made available via the RSS YouTube account. If you don't want your contribution to be shown, please contact us by email. Okay, so today we are pleased to have Professor David Hand from Imperial College London. David, I'm sure many of you know him, is a prestigious mathematician and statistician. He has published over 300 papers and 30 books. He has also been awarded many medals and awards, including being made OBE in 2013. He has served twice as president of the Royal Statistical Society. Truly prestigious. Today, we are going to listen to his talk on his new book, Dark Data, Why what you don't know matters. David, it's on you.
Let me first give set some context and, if you like, lower expectations about what you might get out of this talk. This talk is in fact based, as you've just heard, on my recent book, Dark Data, Why What You Don't Know Matters. And this is a popular book. It's not a technical book. It doesn't have any maths in it, for example. The aim of the book was to convey some of the power, but mainly some of the problems of statistics and data science, some of the things you need to look out for, some of the reasons that you need to take care. So if you are a sort of professional data scientist or statistician, don't expect too much. So I hope I've sufficiently lowered expectations. What I'm going to do to kick off is tell you what I mean by dark data. I'm not going to do this by giving you a definition. I'm going to do it by giving you a series of examples. So the first example is a little story that many of you will be familiar with. It's about elephant powder. You're walking down the road, you come across an elderly man putting little piles of powder down the center of the road, and you say to him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "It's elephant powder. It's to keep the elephants away." And you say, "But there are no elephants here." And he replies, "Well, yes, it's wonderfully effective, isn't it?" Of course, what he's missing is what would happen if he didn't put the elephant powder down. He discovered that that was just as effective at keeping the elephants away. He's missing some important information. He might then go on to discover that there were no elephants to be kept away. He's missing some counterfactual, crucial thing. Here's another little example, which interestingly enough has exactly the same abstract mathematical structure as the elephant powder example, but much more serious consequences. In around 1985, about 1.2 million people around the world died of measles. Due to a miracle of modern medicine, vaccination, that's now shrunk to about 100,000 a year. In fact, since the turn of the century, about 25 million lives have been saved because of measles vaccination. Actually, it's far more serious than that. It's recently been discovered that measles damages the immune system, and it's thought that 4 times as many people die of some other cause because their immune system has been damaged by measles. So we're really talking about 125 million lives saved since the turn of the century because of measles vaccination. But now put yourself in the position of a parent with a young child trying to decide whether to have your child vaccinated. You might think, well, 100,000 around the world is not very many. You might think, well, no one I know has died of measles. None of my workmates, none of my friends, none of my family, none of my child's friends have died of measles. So I think the danger is exaggerated. But of course, what you're missing is, just like the elephant powder example, crucial counterfactual data. There is dark data being obscured from you, which is leading you to draw an incorrect conclusion. Third example doesn't appear in the book, actually. This is such a classic example that I decided not to include it in the book on the grounds that I think a lot of people will have heard of it. It's to do with Allied bombers returning from sorties over Europe during the Second World War, when they came back peppered with bullet holes, like in this picture. And the question was, where should you put armor on these aircraft to protect them? You couldn't armor them everywhere because they'd never get off the ground if you did that. The obvious answer is, well, you put them where all the bullet holes tend to cluster, like in the fuselage in this picture. But a very clever man named Abraham Wald, working for the Statistical Research Group in Manhattan at the time, said, no, that's quite wrong. You should put them where the bullet hole, you should put the armor where the bullet holes aren't. He reasoned that aircraft which got back safely, peppered with bullet holes like this one, didn't get shot down. The bullet holes showed parts of the aircraft that they could go through safely. But the ones that didn't return were the ones where the bullet holes, where the bullets entered the engine compartment or the pilot compartment. So you never saw those. So again, dark data. My fourth example is Hurricane Sandy. October 2012, the second most serious hurricane in American history at that time. $75 billion worth of damage, 200 people killed. The thing about Hurricane Sandy is that it was accompanied by a Twitter storm. That physical storm was accompanied by a Twitter storm. And Twitter, of course, tells you what happens, when it's happening, to whom it's happening, and so on. It tells you exactly where you should send the emergency services. Except, consider this, imagine a community which had been completely obliterated by Hurricane Sandy or by a hurricane. All the power was out, all the phone masts were down and so on. You wouldn't get any messages from them saying, this is really where we need to send the emergency services. So crucial, dark data again, obscure data, things you're not seeing. And my final little introductory example from a completely different area concerns employment rate of disabled people. And this graph shows you, it goes from 2013 to 2020, and it shows you the proportion of disabled people unemployed. And you can see that the unemployment rate is decreasing, which looks like a great result, but less great if you include this extra piece of data, this extra piece of information, which is the number of people classified as disabled over the same time period. So good that that top graph has a downward trend, but the reason for that is not that the numerator, the number of unemployed disabled people, is decreasing. It's that the denominator is increasing, so that the ratio is decreasing. All of these examples illustrate crucial misunderstandings that can arise when you're missing some data. Now, we're all familiar, everybody here today, as it were, is familiar with the power of data. We know that data plus data science and statistics with algorithms lead to improved understanding and better decisions, enabling us to produce better government policies, improve sporting performance, produce more effective medical treatments, gain better customer understanding, make scientific breakthroughs, and so on and on and on and on. This is part of the power of the data science revolution. And we're all also familiar with these sorts of phrases, which totally pervade the media at the moment. Big data, of course, artificial intelligence, data exhaust, administrative data, all sorts of things. But all of those phrases basically tell you about the data you have. They say, with these data, we can do amazing things, which is true. But what they don't is tell you about the data you don't have, like in my introductory examples. And they don't, like in those examples, tell you about the problems that can arise because you're missing something crucial. They don't say that the data you don't have, the dark data, can be even more important than the data you do have. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to kick off with a little example. I should say that the problems I'm talking about are pervasive. They affect big data sets and small data sets. I'm going to kick off with very quickly this one of my favorite little examples, which you'll all be familiar with. It's one of my favorite examples because it involves just 7 data points, tiny data set, but also 7 fatalities. It is, of course, the Challenger space shuttle disaster from January 1986. And I suspect that most of you will be familiar with this. You will know that it was caused by the O-ring seals between the booster rockets on the side of the big fuel tank in the picture becoming less malleable in cold weather. And this launch occurred at cold weather. And you all know that a jet of flame got through a gap between one of these less malleable rubber seals and projected onto the fuel tank. And the 73 seconds after the launch and 9 miles high, and then it blew up. The crew compartment went into a ballistic trajectory up to a height of 12 miles and then crashed into the sea, killing all astronauts. Now, the night before the launch, as many of you will know, a teleconference was held, and this was the, amongst other things, this was one of the sources of data, pieces of data that they looked at. Each dot here represents a previous shuttle launch. The horizontal axis shows temperature at launch. The vertical axis shows number of O-ring problems on that launch. So you can see, for example, that the lowest temperature previous launch, let's see if we can do it, which was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 of the O-rings had a problem. And at the highest previous launch, 2 of the O-rings had a problem. Most of them only had 1 problem. Now, if I had more time, if this were a sort of lecture, I would pause there and say, there's something funny about this graph. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's something a little bit odd about it. And I'd ask you to try to think about this and say, what's funny? What's a little bit peculiar? What is potentially misleading about this graph? And what's potentially odd about it, I'm not going to pause, what's potentially odd about it is that it seems to show that every previous launch had at least 1 O-ring suffering a problem. There were none with no O-rings suffering a problem. There are no dots on the horizontal 0 level of the vertical axis. And in fact, if you knew how many previous shuttle launches there were, you would know that this isn't all of them. And when you add in those missing data, the air temperatures at which the launches with no O-ring problems occurred, you get a completely different picture. They're all down there. Now you can see a very clear trend. Without the red dots, there's no apparent trend, safe to go ahead with the launch. With the red dots, very clear trend, higher temperature, lower likelihood of suffering an O-ring problem, lower temperature, higher likelihood. And in fact, if you draw a vertical line at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, every launch below that suffers a problem, and only 4 out of 21, I think it is, above that suffer from an O-ring problem. So drawing a conclusion just based on the partial data, omitting the dark data, leads to misleading conclusions. And in fact, if I add the projected forecast temperature for the day of the launch, which was down there, had you looked at this, had you spotted there was something funny about that partial plot at the beginning, you'd have probably decided not to go ahead with the launch. Okay. That was an example with very small data sets, 7 data points. Here's one with a much bigger data set in an entirely different area. I'm going to contrast the rate of heart disease in Japan with that in the US. And here we are, per annum, per 100,000 men in Japan, 41 suffer from heart problems, die of a heart attack, die of heart problems, and 87 in the US. So less than half in Japan than in the US. Okay, now let's look at some of the risk factors for this. We would probably expect them to be worse in the US. Well, one of the primary risk factors is smoking. Smoking isn't a good idea as far as heart disease is concerned. And you can see something rather puzzling there. More than twice as many men in Japan, the proportion of men who smoke in Japan is twice that in the US, which is odd given the way the heart disease rates go. Another risk factor is systolic blood pressure. Again, high is bad. Again, it's higher in Japan. Another is cholesterol level. Again, high is bad and it's higher in Japan, not much higher, but nevertheless higher. Now, sure, all of these risk factors are correlated, but nevertheless, we've got 3 primary risk factors for heart disease, which are all higher, worse in Japan, and yet the heart disease rate in Japan is less than half that in the US. So what's going on? Well, we all know, of course, in inverted commas, that this is because the Japanese have a diet which is high in fish, and that contains a substance called omega-3, which is protective against heart attacks. But now consider this. In Japan are regarded as a low status disease. They sort of imply manual labor, digging roads, construction, that kind of thing. In contrast, in Japan are a high status disease, implying cerebral labor, sort of things all you guys do. So isn't it just possible that what would be diagnosed as a heart attack in the US might be classified as a stroke in Japan? So it's not overt missing data, hidden data, concealed data, absent data. It's data which is reclassified, different definitions. And maybe that's misleading things. Of course, if this last observation, that there's a potential differential diagnosis, not misdiagnosis, just different ways of diagnosing, we would then, if that's right, we would expect the stroke rate in Japan to be higher than that in the US. And it is. It's 50% higher. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not saying that heart attacks, that omega-3 isn't protective against heart attacks. What I'm saying is I think it's highly likely that both of these factors contribute to that puzzling anomaly with those proportions going in opposite directions at the top. Okay, now in my book, I produce a taxonomy of different types of dark data, trying to understand and enable people to identify these things so they can do something about it. One crucial thing to observe is that they're not mutually exclusive. Just because you've collected your data and you said, oh, I think there's something funny going on. Oh, yes, I'm missing certain parts of the data. Doesn't mean that other kinds of dark data might not always occur, might not also occur. These different types of dark data can occur together. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to give you an idea, I shall go through a few of them. 2 of the 15 types will be very familiar to you. They're type 1, I call them type 1, data we know are missing, and type 2, data we don't know are missing. And the reason they're familiar is because they're Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And an example of the first, I've got a survey here, extract from a survey in which age, height, weight, and sex were collected. And you can see that the second row, the second person, has an NA, not available value for age. Now, of course, we know they've got an age, we just don't know what it is. So it's a known unknown. Contrast that with people who don't respond to a question in a blog. You don't know who read the blog, who might have responded, who wanted to respond but didn't. You don't know who responded twice, perhaps. These really are unknown unknowns. You don't know anything about that. A third type of missing data is choosing just some cases, and a sort of classic example of this are psychics. What psychics tend to do is make lots of predictions, and then after the fact, draw your attention to the ones they got right, ignoring all the others. The others just fade into the background, become dark data. You don't see those. You forget about them. Why would you remember them? The organization Gartner has a definition of dark data, which is my type 3 dark data. They described it, they define it as the information assets organizations collect, process, and store during regular business activities, but generally fail to use for other purposes. They've collected the data, put it into their giant database, and then they just ignore it. It just fades away. They never look at it. They don't extract meaning from it. They don't perhaps identify problems with the other data from it. So that's the Gartner definition of type 3. Special type of type 3 is self-selection. So for example, customers who shop at a particular store, if you're running a shop or a store, you might be interested in expanding your customer base. Of course, to do that, what you need to know is how other people who don't shop at your store behave so that you can induce them to shop at your store. But of course, by definition, they're different from the ones who shop at your store. They chose not to. So again, there's dark data that you would like to know about. Type 5 is missing variables. All of my previous examples involve either entire records missing, entire sort of people about which you know nothing, for example, or characteristics, variables within records, like the missing age in my little survey example. This 5th type is when you are missing whole variables on a data set. And here's a little example, people who survived the Titanic. So there were 908 crew on the Titanic. Of those, 212 survived. There were 627 third-class passengers, and 151 of those survived. The proportions are like that. So you had a better chance of surviving the disaster if you were a third-class passenger than a crew. Not a huge difference, but nevertheless a difference. The numbers are quite big. Okay, now let's split this by sex. I've got male. There were 885 male crew members on board, and 192 of those survived. Similar sort of thing for third-class passengers, and here are the proportions. So you can see that whereas overall you have a better chance of surviving if you were a third-class passenger, if you were a man, you have a better chance of surviving if you were a crew member. And now let's do the same for female. 23 of the crew were female, 20 of those survived. Similar thing for third-class passengers. proportions. You basically have twice as much chance of surviving if you're a crew member than a third-class passenger. So for males and females separately, you're better off being crew, but altogether, you're better off being a third-class passenger. Now, there seems to be a contradiction here. And whenever you see a table like this with an apparent contradiction in it put up by me, first thing you should do is suspect an arithmetic error, because that's always the most common reason for me making a mistake or producing an apparent contradiction. But in this case, you can see the raw numbers and you can check them afterwards if you like. The numbers are right. There is something puzzling going on here. And many of you will recognize this as Simpson's paradox. The answer to the question, which you want to know, well, which should I believe? Are third-class passengers better off or crew better off? Depends subtly on the exact formulation of the question you want to ask. But in this case, I'm not going to go into details. I don't have time. All I want to do is draw your attention to the fact that if sex hadn't been recorded, if we didn't know whether they were male or female, we'd be stuck with the first answer, drawing the conclusion that third-class passengers were better off. If, in fact, the question really related to the sexes separately, then we wouldn't be able to answer that question if we hadn't recorded it. And we would draw the wrong conclusion because the crucial variable, sex in this case, would be missing. So here are the other 10 types of dark data in my taxonomy. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, except for just to say one thing and mention something about one or two of them. My book came out in February 2020, and you'll recognize that time as the start of the pandemic. So my book doesn't have the word COVID or corona in them, or coronavirus in it at all. The fact is, however, that this pandemic has been riddled with dark data issues. All sorts of points and questions of misunderstanding have arisen because of dark data in the pandemic. It would be easy to write a book about dark data in the COVID-19 pandemic, if anybody's interested. So what I'm going to do is just pick out a few of these and illustrate. And the first example, of course, is something we saw right at the start with my elephant powder man and my measles vaccination. Trials, randomized controlled trials and so on, you try to tell you the counterfactual. They try to tell you what would have happened if you'd given the people different treatments. They try to tell you what might have been. They try to reveal a certain of dark data. And of course, vaccine trials are being conducted and have been conducted, and have told us, given us lots of valuable information about dark data. What would have happened if you'd given them a different treatment? Definitions of data. My Japanese and US heart attack example involved different definitions. Here's another little one related to COVID, and there are many examples, as I say, in COVID. On the 28th of May, the UK was reporting 267,000 cases of COVID-19, and amongst those, 37,000 deaths. Russia, on the other hand, was reporting 379,000 cases and only 4,000 deaths. Now, why is this? Well, there are various possible dark data explanations, but one of them is that they're using different definitions. For example, simply, did you die of COVID or with COVID? That makes a difference. And there are many more subtleties than that. But you can see from this that different definitions conceal things in different ways and lead you to draw very different conclusions. Summaries of data. Summaries of data, we all know, obscure things. A mean doesn't tell you anything about the extremes or skewness. It doesn't tell you if everybody's got the same value, the mean value or whatever. So summaries of data hide data. They are, if you like, a source of potentially important dark data. And of course, we see this in the COVID case where we get aggregate averages and numbers and proportions reported. But of course, cases tend to occur in clusters. And so you could be living in an area which is, you have basically no chance of getting COVID, or you could be living in an area where you have a very high chance. The average conceals which of those it is. My final little COVID example involves feedback and gaming. Distorting data in response to the data you've got, for example. And Donald Trump, you remember him, came up with either deliberately or by accident a very nice example of this, which is that you can reduce the apparent COVID infection rate by reducing the number of tests you carry out. And as I say, every aspect, every type of dark data can be illustrated with examples from this pandemic in many different ways. A general sort of high-level observation here. I guess perhaps most of you are familiar with the reproducibility crisis or the replicability crisis in science, which shows that, especially in certain scientific disciplines, a lot of the apparently firmly established results fade away when the studies are repeated. The reason for that is predominantly due to different kinds of dark data. For example, selection processes produce what's called the file draw effect, where somebody collects the data, carries out the analysis, writes and starts to write it up, but the results are not very striking, they're not significant, the effects are very small. And so they think, well, okay, I'll write that up, but of course, first I've got to prepare all next term's lectures or run the department or whatever it is. And those things become more pressing, and the rather uninteresting result never actually gets written out, never appears in the scientific literature. So a sort of process of drift towards the more striking results occurs. Regression to the mean illustrates this. Big effects have two primary causes. One is the big apparent effects have two primary underlying causes. One is that there may be a real effect, a real treatment effect, which is quite large, but also all analyses have random variation associated with them. We never have perfect 100% data. And it's entirely possible that a big effect will be due to an underlying effect, which might be large, but then with a big random effect added to it. So you see an exceptionally large effect. And that, of course, gets written up and published. But of course, when the study is replicated, that random effect could just as easily be in the opposite direction and dramatically shrink the result so that the study appears to be non-reproducible. You'd expect that. It's just a fundamental aspect of the way data behave. But it's interesting that one surprising consequence of that is that results published in the more prestigious journals appear to be less likely to be true. More prestigious journals like to publish striking results. That's how they maintain their prestige. Authors like to publish in more prestigious journals. So if they get a big effect, off they go to the more prestigious journals. But of course, then due to effects like regression to the mean, those studies turn out not to be reproducible, or the effect turns out to be much less large. And this observation in italics in the second half of this slide is not just me saying this. There have been studies of this, and it is true that the more prestigious journals have a higher retraction rate. Okay, so that's the first half of the talk. What I've talked about is the problems of dark data. I've aimed to alarm you so that you rush out and buy the book to discover what's in the second half of the book. What do we do about dark data? Well, there are various strategies, various existing strategies that you'll be familiar with. Compare with what you'd expect, obviously. Maybe your expectations are wrong, but maybe the data are wrong. You can do complete case analysis where you only analyze those records which don't have any missing values. And perhaps I don't need to say what risk you're taking there. It's entirely possible, especially if you've got a data set with lots of variables, that every case has some missing value, so you don't have any data. You can use all the available data in the sense of, if you wanted to remember my little survey example, I could calculate the average age just using the values with people who recorded their age. But of course, there's potential distortion in that because maybe the other people are different. You can impute the average of observed values. I could take the recorded values of age, calculate their average, and plug that in for the missing values. But of course, that has problems as well. It's unlikely that everybody who didn't record their age had the same age. These values, these three methods, you will sometimes find them in standard software, statistical data science software packages. They're very simple and they have the potential to be misleading. Sometimes they can be appropriate, but they can be misleading, and you need to think very carefully about them. Moving on, we can do something more sophisticated. Rather than just calculating the average of the observed values, we can look at values which have been observed for our variable of interest and pair it with other values which have been observed, and from that calculate relationships and predict missing values for the variable we're interested in. And you can you can elaborate this in various ways. A particularly powerful tool is multiple imputation, where you do that prediction multiple times so that you get a distribution, a range of values. And as we develop these in more sophisticated ways, we get very clever iterative methods, such as the EM algorithm, which I'm not going to have time to go into today. I just want to make a cautionary observation. This is that statisticians and data scientists using powerful machine learning and AI tools, statistical tools, can do amazing things. But you can't perform miracles. If you've got dark data, you have a fundamental problem. You need to think very carefully about it. The basic principle for tackling it is to shine a light on it, stop it being dark data. Or to put it another way, what you try to do is use what you do know about what you don't know. I could sort of elaborate that, and I'm going to in a moment, into use what you know about why the data are dark to inform what you don't know. So here's a little example I'm going to use as a running example in the next few slides. I should say I've got a tripartite taxonomy of mechanisms for missing data. This is basically due to Donald Rubin, except for I've changed the names, terminology, because I don't think his terminology I think it's particularly opaque to non-statisticians. I don't think it's very clear terminology. So I've changed the terminology, but it's basically the same structure. So 3 kinds of mechanism. First, your data might be dark because it's not data dependent, by which I mean it's missing for reasons unrelated to the data. And here's an example. Students might not sit an exam because they fall ill. And that's not going to differentially affect the more able or the less able students. It's going to just hit students at random. Second, it might be scene data dependent. Now it might be missing for reasons related to the data you've got. So for example, school might discourage the less able students from sitting an exam. So now those who would have scored worse are more likely not to give a result. That's SDD. And UDD, unseen data dependent. This is missing because of the values you would have obtained had you been able to measure the thing. And so, for example, a student might realize that they'd revised the wrong material the night before the exam. So they thought, I'm going to do appallingly in the exam, I won't turn up. Now, the score they would have got, which would have been very bad, won't be observed. Okay, so let's look at this. My aim is to estimate what would be the average final exam score for a school if every student had been examined. That's what I'm trying to do. And the data I've got to do it with are the final exam score just for those who sat the exam, not for those who didn't sit it, or because they were ill or didn't turn up for some reason, but also the previous test results for all students. The school's been testing them over the years, knows how well they've done in the past. So here's my complete data. If I did have exam scores and everything for everybody, on the vertical axis, I've got exam result. On the horizontal axis, I've got previous test results. And if I had all the data, I could calculate the average I'm interested in, the exact average exam result for all students, and there it is. When the data are not data dependent, some of those dots, let's toggle between them, some of those dots are missing at random, but they're dispersed overall. So I'm not getting any distortion or bias or sort of, if you like, corruption in the data. So I can still calculate the average, and it will be a valid estimate. It will have a high variance because it's based on a smaller sample, but no bias problems. That's not data dependent. Let's go back to the complete data. Now, the scene data. Scene data dependent. Those with lower scores on previous test results to the left of the graph are more likely not to turn up. The school discouraged those students from sitting the exam. Now, if I were to calculate the mean, it would be biased upwards because the lower left people are disproportionately missing. But note that particular value of the previous test results, I can look at the conditional distribution of those dots in that little rectangle and get a perfectly valid estimate of the average for those who had, in my example, a previous test score of -1. So I can use this idea to produce a regression line, perfectly valid regression line. And then, of course, I can interpolate the values of students in the left-hand side and get a valid estimate of what I'm interested in, the overall exam result. And then finally, my complete data again, and unseen data dependent. You remember how this works? Now, the students don't turn up if they're likely to get a particular kind of result, a poor result in this case. So I'm missing the lower half of the graph in this case. Now, again, if I were to calculate the mean, it would be biased upwards. And if I were to calculate the conditional mean within that little rectangle, it's no good this time because my data are more sparse than they should be in the lower half, but not in the upper half. So I either have to do something much more sophisticated. I certainly can't fit an ordinary regression line unless I know why the data are missing and the mechanism for it, which obviously I do in my artificial example. I'm stuck. Unseen data are a particularly challenging case. Okay, so what have I done? I've given you lots of illustrations of the dangers. I've tried at a very, very superficial level to illustrate what you might do about it. Now I'm going to change tack entirely. I'm going to talk about the power of dark data, or as I see it, as I say it, the strategic application of ignorance, how you can gain from dark data. And I don't mean just sort of perpetrating fraud, hiding the truth from people or something like that. I mean something much more interesting. Revealing by concealing. And here is a little example I like. It's quite an old example, but it's really quite elegant, I think. In 1927, Holland adopted a confidential system of reporting causes of death. So they hid the identity of people who had died from particular diseases. And as a consequence, the number of deaths in Amsterdam attributed to syphilis increased dramatically. So we're actually getting at the truth now by hiding something. We're revealing previously invisible data, the numbers of deaths from this cause. We're making it visible, and we're doing that by making other data invisible. Power of dark data, strategic application of ignorance. Now, of course, you use these ideas all the time. You keep your medical and financial records secret or dark by using password, and they keep the data dark. They need to be kept dark themselves. So dark data on dark data. A little observation about, okay, what I'm going to do now is basically flip familiar methods of statistics that you use all the time and you're perfectly familiar with on their heads. Sample surveys, of course, are normally quite rightly described as using a small percentage of a population, carefully chosen, randomly selected, part of a population, 10% in my little example here. But of course, another way of looking at that is that what you're doing is making 90% of the population dark. Likewise, randomized controlled trials. One aspect of those is that they hide which treatment is given. They blind the researchers, the medics giving the treatment, the patients, from the truth about which data is which. So in some sense, very literal kind of dark data. Okay, and I'm working towards a conclusion now. More advanced statistical methods and tools, cutting-edge statistical tools, can also be regarded as manifestations of dark data. They are often manifestations of data that could have arisen. You didn't see it because it didn't arise, but it could easily have happened. So it's a different kind of dark data. For example, one of the things that many of you will do is that you'll have a theory, a model, or whatever, and you'll generate multiple data sets from that, and you'll look at the behavior of those data sets. That's simulation, standard statistical tool. Likewise, if fitting a model to something, you may generate extra randomly perturbed copies, combine them with the original data, and then fit your model to this enhanced data set, the original data plus the other data, a little bit perturbed, which could have arisen had it been collected slightly differently. If you do that and then fit a model to the enhanced data set, you are smoothing the data. You're avoiding overfitting, regularization, standard statistical tool. Another example is to take multiple subsamples of the data. I want to know whether a particular parameter, particular estimate of a parameter I want to know its variance. Well, I can take a subsample of the data, estimate the parameter, another subsample, estimate the parameter, and look at the distribution of those estimates. And this is, of course, bootstrap methods. And then another thing is that in classification problems, most real classification problems end up misclassifying, some misdiagnosing people, misrecognizing a spoken word or whatever. So you get incorrect classifications. One way to improve the performance of a classification algorithm is to take the points data objects you got wrong and produce copies of them and add them back into the data and then fit your model again to the enhanced data set. So now the algorithm, the model, the statistical approach is focusing on the misclassified data points. This is called boosting, another perfectly standard statistical tool. And then finally, another method is to use additional imprecisely specified data that you believe has a certain distribution or you know something about, but you can't give the details, you can't give the actual numbers. And that's just another way of looking at Bayesian statistics. So all of these tools, perfectly standard statistical tools, which in some sense are the bedrock of modern statistics, use data that you didn't see but could have seen, different kind of dark data, leading to very powerful tools. So let me wind up so we have a time for questions if there are any. I ended by saying that sophisticated strategic use of dark data can be a very powerful tool, that little list of 5 classes of tools. But I started by saying that dark data can have serious consequences, and I hope, as I say, worrying you about the potential serious consequences so that you rush out and buy the book. That was the aim. But I started with that little example, that little anecdote about the elephant powder man. I'm going to conclude with another little anecdote, another one you'll be familiar with, the drunk looking for his wallet, leaning against the lamppost. So he's leaning against this lamppost, staring at the ground, and you say, "Have you lost something?" And he says, "Yes, I dropped my wallet." And you say, "Where did you drop it?" And he said, "Oh, I dropped it over there," pointing into the dark. "But you can't see over there, so I'm looking here where the light is." And I'm suggesting to you that if you ignore dark data, you're behaving like that drunk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's very impressive. So, I mean, I agree with you. It probably doesn't touch any technical details, but after I listened to your talk, I felt exactly the same way. I mean, I mainly work on the medical data, and one of the biggest problem indeed is the dark data side. That when collecting clinical data, unfortunately, we can only collect a subset of informations, and you actually don't know what information is relevant to your question and what not. You just have to try, and it's even worse if you start. I mean, the whole study starts from a clinician that they themselves collect a data that believed to be relevant, and then ask for help to look at it. And quickly we will find a controversial conclusions arising from that data set, and then we try to understand it, and then we have to go back to the original large patient data set, patient database to find more information, because otherwise you'll just not be able to explain it. But later on, more often than not, that this controversial conclusion may comes from confounders that has not been accounted in the first place. Yeah. So yes, so I'm very impressed by.
Can I just say? I think yes. I think the point you've made is absolutely spot on and very important. Clearly, by definition, you can't collect all data. You know, that doesn't. The very phrase just doesn't make sense. So you have to decide for any particular study what data you're going to collect. And so you have to make choices, and quite clearly the whole thing is an iterative process. You collect some data, you conduct an analysis, you perhaps recognize that you need more information about something, you recognize that you could be being misled by something else, and gradually understanding grows. And in fact, if you look at the progress of science, think of the discovery that smoking causes lung cancer and so on. You know, people didn't understand this at the beginning, but as they collected more data, so understanding grew. So I think the point you make, you can't collect all data. It's an iterative process, gradually understanding increases with time is crucial. Yes, well, I agree entirely. Yeah.
Right. So Tim has a question. I will just read it. So Tim said, "Thank you for the great and insightful talk. Do you think journals discourage discussion of dark data or reporting of confusing results by trying to make manuscripts look as sure as possible about the results?"
Oh, that's a lovely question. Yeah. I certainly, in the past, certainly, and also now, but to a lesser extent, sort of limitations on space in journals have meant that authors have been encouraged to make their descriptions as concise as possible, not to go into too much detail, sometimes meaning you can't actually work out what they did. I think that's less important now with the web, of course, but I'm sure it's still there. Journals, not just journals, people, of course, in general, want a clear, definitive answer. We've seen this again and again with the COVID pandemic. People want to know, well, is it this or is it this? Not, well, it's probably this, but it could be the other. There's a chance it could be the other. I don't think journals are too bad, but they could be better. But I think the problem is, actually, let me backtrack a bit on this. The problem is that people want a definitive answer. And here is where I will say something rather unusual. I feel sorry for politicians, because it's all very well for us scientists to say, well, I think it's 80% this, but it could be this, 20% this. A politician has to make a decision, has to do something, has to implement a policy. So I think they're very much at the sharp end of things.
Okay, so Simon have another question. Do you think the move to big data, real-time data, is increasing the dark data problem?
I don't know if it's increasing it. I think it's always been a problem, but certainly real-time data do generate opportunities for new kinds of dark data. I should have said during my talk that although I produce this taxonomy of 15 types of dark data, new kinds of data are coming along all the time, being collected in different ways and so on. You've only got to look back at the genomics revolution over the last couple of decades to see that. And now with real-time telemetry and so on, new kinds of data coming along. So there will be new kinds of dark data issues arising from this. So I don't know if the problem's getting any worse, but it's certainly arising in different ways, different ways.
I mean, to be honest, I have analyzed some real-time data and longitudinal, not really real-time, but sometimes I found the challenge is that during the course of a treatment, you actually have more than one clinical event, but not the one that you're interested in. So actually, it's very difficult to find out whether the trajectories of your data come from the clinical event that you collected, or is actually there's something at the back, that there's a new disease kick in, or there's a new side effect kick in.
That's absolutely right. If in any kind of study you change the measuring instrument as you go along, and it might be because surveys are done differently or medical procedures and investigations are done differently, if you change the instrument that is producing the results as you go along, then you don't know if it's because the underlying process is changing or it's just due to the changing nature of the instrument. Absolutely, yeah.
So we have another questions. Cardinus said, thank you for your thought-provoking talk. In the context of causality, what are your thoughts around ignorance of the non-statistics real data generating process? Can dark data be also conceptual and or mechanistic?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I did have a slide in my presentation, but decided I needed to shorten it, which talks a bit about these sorts of issues. Fundamentally, there are two kinds of statistical model. what I call theory-driven and data-driven. Theory-driven models are based on some strong underlying, probably causal sort of understanding of what's going on. Physics, of course, is full of these theory-driven models. We have theories about how the universe was constructed and subatomic particles and so on. We understand, in some sense, things, and we can predict results through causal mechanisms from that. Theory-driven. The other kind of model are data-driven, where you just look at a body of data, nowadays a large body of data, and you just observe relationships, correlations, differences of means, and so on in the data. The modern big data and data science revolution is largely a consequence of data-driven models. Big data sets, people building predictive models on the data without any underlying theory. For example, I did a lot of work in the past in consumer credit, trying to predict whether people are good or bad credit risks, for instance. And the fundamental model there is not a formula describing psychological theory about whether somebody will likely default on a loan. It's purely a logistic regression tree. That's the classic model in that area, just based on how the data happen to fall. And data-driven models, which really underlie the data science revolution we're in the midst of at the moment, are particularly vulnerable to changes in the underlying mechanism. A correlation could disappear. They are particularly brittle, if you like. And I think that there are fundamental difficulties there. I think we're quite significantly at risk, and you can see this when data-driven models are used to predict economic situations, and the economy changes, goes into a recession or something like that. The models cease to become of value because the nature of the data on which they were built is no longer relevant. Whereas a theory-driven model, which is based on some relationship, understanding of how things are related, assuming your theory is right, of course, are much less brittle.
Okay, so we will have one last question from Hudson. So how would you respond to being told by a judge, dataset A is bigger than dataset B, so A is better?
I would say, and how many, I need to think of a nice soundbite answer to that, and I need more time, but I would basically say, and how do you know that any of the values in A are correct? Something like that. But I need to think of a nice, I like that question. I shall now go away and think of a nice response that I wish I could have given now.
Okay, right. I think that's today's event. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much, David. It's a fantastic talk.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.